Right. Hello, and welcome to another msupcm++ tutorial. Today I'm going to do things a little bit differently from my previous tutorials. I'm going to try and take the information that I covered in the previous tutorials and condense it a bit for people who already have experience creating track loops but want to just switch over to this new workflow. In my earlier videos, I spent a lot of time on the fine mechanics of track looping, which kind of led to the videos being really long. I think they were pushing about an hour each. So this time around, if you've already watched those tutorials, then there probably won't be anything new here in this video. So however, if you're completely new to track looping and have never done this before, I would highly recommend checking out those earlier videos because I'm not going to cover a lot of that today. So I will link those in the video description and definitely go check those out. I know they're long, but they are long for a reason. They really do go in depth into the entire kind of process. But today my goal is more just to walk through the process of setting up msupcm++ from scratch for those users who already know how to make these loops, but just don't know how to use my tool, which is entirely reasonable because I made this thing because this is how I work and how I think, and I realize that it's a bit of a learning curve for people who don't necessarily come from that same mindset. So let's see here. So first, just a little bit of a background of why things are the way they are in this tool, because it's a bit of a shift in just the way that the workflow is set up. And the reason is just simply because it's to make it easy to get through a lot of these things. And when I say a lot, I do mean a lot. I kind of lost track a while ago, but I've done, I would estimate, over 500 MSU1 tracks at this point for various games. And with this workflow, I can get through those very quickly. I can keep them organized. I can make changes as needed and just go back, and I can go back to something that I haven't touched in months, and I can make changes and regenerate the tracks, and it all just works. And I don't have to remember where I was on a particular track. I don't have to look things up. I don't have to try and remember where the loop points were. I don't have to remember any of that stuff. It's all contained in the JSON files that we create later, which I'll go over all of that. But that's kind of the reason behind the way this tool is set up. It's just to make it easy to do a lot of this stuff. So it's built as a batch processor. And that's the first thing to know, is that it's a batch processor. And that's also the first hurdle for a lot of people. There's no GUI. You don't open the program. It doesn't even really have a command line interface, which, some people, they go click on it, they see the window flash open, and they're like, oh, it's a command line program. Here, let me open up the command line and try and run it. And it's not. It's two parts. You have the executable, and then you have the config file. And all of your editing is basically done in the config file. It's just a JSON formatted text file. I'll go over all of that here in a minute. But you have all of your things, like you want to trim things off the start of the file. You want to trim the end of the file. You want to set the loop. You want to set the volume. You want to add some padding. You want to do a fade in, a fade out. So all of these operations that you would think that you need to do to the file are all things that you basically just put them in the text file with the parameters that go with them. And then once you have all of those parameters set up for a file, you just run the program, and it goes through and it reads that file, and it says, okay, you want to trim it here, you want to add a fade in, you want to loop here, you want to do a crossfade, it goes through all of those things that you put into the text file, and it just does them. So I am actually working on adding a command, like a real command line interface into the v1.0 release, but it's not quite ready yet. And even then, once it's there, that's not really the primary focus of how this tool works. So even though it'll be there, that's not how I would suggest using it. So the other thing to know is that all of the editing is non-destructive to the original files. So in a normal workflow, like in Audacity, say you went ahead and you found like the end of the file, and you found where you want to loop. So you go to the end of the loop, and you cut everything after that, and you delete it. And then you've got your loop, and you're doing stuff. You do the volume leveling, maybe you add some compression, maybe you add a fade in at the beginning. You do all these effects, whatever processing you're doing. And then you realize, wait a minute, there's actually a second loop to it that adds some extra instruments, and I would actually like to have that. So what do? Well, you did all of these other edits, and you basically have to undo them all and roll them all back to where you deleted off that part that you want now. You have to roll all those changes back, find your new part to delete off, find your new ending point, delete that, and then you have to redo all the work that you just did. And with this, you don't have to do that. You want to change any of the parameters anywhere in the chain. All you do is you just change it in the text file and run it again, and it does all of the steps from beginning to end and outputs a new file. And it doesn't modify the original file, so you can run it as many times as you want, and it'll keep working. And it's not like when you save a JPEG and then you save it again and you save it again and you save it again, and the compression artifacts just get worse and worse and worse. It doesn't do that because you're starting from the same source file every single time. So okay, now that we've got the background kind of worked out, so let's just kind of dive right into it. So the first thing you're going to want is you can use any text editor that you want to edit this JSON file. I would highly recommend Visual Studio Code, not the full Visual Studio. It's called Visual Studio Code, and it's an editor put out by Microsoft that it's a lot like it's built on Electron. It's a lot like Atom, if you've ever used the Atom editor. But I know some people are kind of touchy about their text editors. I'll say I'm a fan of Notepad++. I use Notepad++ for just about everything. But for this particular for this particular work, there's one feature in particular that is just huge for making this work just so much smoother, and I have not found any other editor other than Visual Studio Code that does this. So first things first, you're going to want to go ahead and download and install Visual Studio Code. Just trust me, just do it. I know it's a big installer, it's whatever, just do it. So next up, we're going to download msupcm++. So I'll have a link to this in the description. But some people who are not familiar with GitHub are not familiar with this feature right here, the releases. But this is where the actual executable is. If you go here and you click the link that says download, this will just download the source code, and you don't want the source code. You want this. You come here and you just download the latest version. Now, for some reason, Microsoft has decided to flag version 0.6 as like potentially unwanted software, and I don't know why. I've submitted it to them for review and haven't managed to get it cleared up. So if this causes problems for you, you can roll back to version 0.5. There's not a whole lot of difference, unless you're doing some of the more advanced subchannel subtrack mixing, or if you're getting a bunch of clipping. If you want to build on Linux, then you will need version 0.6, but then, the whole Microsoft thing is the problem anyway. So go ahead and download msupcm++. And I'm just going to go ahead and put it here in this folder. And then the other thing you're probably going to want is it's really handy to be able to just listen to the tracks after you've created them without having to pull up the emulator or your flash card or whatever and then actually go into the game and go to the place where it's at. So I actually have a solution for that as well. It's also on GitHub here. It's foo input msu right here. And again, go to the releases and you'll see it's just this DLL. You'll want to download this. I'm not going to download it right now. But this is an input plugin for foobar 2K. It's a music player. A lot of people use it. So just go ahead and, I'll link this in the description. Foobar 2K. Go ahead and download Foobar 2K. Then you download this DLL. And then to install it, hold on. Go in. I'm doing this off screen, but okay. So you're going to open up, wherever you install Foobar 2K. And it's going to be right here. And then you just open the components folder. And then you drop that DLL right in here into the components folder. And that's all you have to do to install that. And that'll let you play back PCM files after you create them. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should just have this folder with, msupcm.exe. So, people try and run it, and, that'll happen. They're like, what happens? Maybe they might try this, and, well, that's not very useful. So, like I said, it is all based on this JSON file. So, by default, it's looking for a file called tracks.json. But you can name it anything you want. You could name it mypack.json, whatever. But when you double click on it, it's going to look for tracks.json. If you want to name it something else, you can use whatever you want, and you just take it and you drag and drop it like that, and then it'll work. However, we don't have anything in our JSON file, so it's still not doing anything. So now open tracks.json. In Visual Studio Code. And so you'll notice I have the terminal open down here. I like doing that rather than double clicking up here, dragging and dropping. If you're comfortable in the terminal, this is really handy. You can just go to View Terminal, and it'll open up this window down here. If you're not, don't worry about it. You can still do the double click thing. So, give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up this. Okay, so this is one that I use kind of as a unit test. And right here, this is that killer feature that I was talking about as far as why you want to use Visual Studio Code instead of some other editor. This line right here. Now, if you don't want to just type all of that in, go ahead and I'll pull this back up. So in my GitHub repo here, I have this configs folder. These are examples. These can be very useful to you if you just want to go ahead and open one of these up and see this is what it should look like. And you can grab that schema line from right here. So that schema actually points to this file right here, which you don't really need to concern yourself with too much. But by typing that right here, take a look at that. It gives you autocomplete for all of the options that are available for this tool. So we can do things like, okay, so I'll do a quick, just kind of a explanation of some of these. So these up here, these are all optional. These are just display only. I use them for organizing my packs, because like I said, I've got over like 500 tracks that I've done. So I like to give them names telling me, you know, this would normally be the game, like A Link to the Past or Metroid or whatever game you're working on. This would be the pack that you're working on. I have a pack that I did from the Link Between Worlds soundtrack, so I would put that here. Just, it's the name of, you can think of it like the album name if you want to think of it that way. So this is that. The artist, again, that would be like the artist who did the source files, if there happens to be a particular artist. Sometimes I just grab tracks from a bunch of different sources, so there's no single artist. URL, typically I use this as a reminder of where I got the tracks from. Now, that can be really helpful if down the road I realize I made a mistake and I need to go get the same track. Or in some cases, I have actually used this for music that is commercially available for purchase, and I will put the link to purchase the music there. So normalization, this is just a volume level. Output prefix, this is this is going to be used for the file name. So if you use the output prefix of track, your tracks are going to be track-1.pcm, track-2.pcm, track-3.pcm. Track is the default output prefix, and it's the output prefix used by Hegan. However, if you're wanting to use it on the SD to SNS or in SNS 9X or BSNS Plus, the output prefix actually is going to want to match your ROM file name. So if your ROM file is alttp.sfc, you're going to want to use alttp here. So let's ignore the rest of this for now, and we'll jump right into kind of the So again, here's all the things we can do. We can do compression, crossfades, we can do fades, loop points, normalization, padding. I'll talk a little bit about subtracks and channels in a little bit. Tempo, if you want to speed up or slow down. So track number, that is a required one though, so we're going to start with that. Title is not required, but again, it's something that the program displays as it's outputting, and it's just helpful to know. So we're just going to call this test track 1. Actually, no, we're not going to call it test track 1. Let me grab. So yeah, here's all of my here's all the stuff that I've worked on at various points in the past. We're going to grab this. Drop it right here. So title is just going to be high roll field. File, this one is required. That is just the input file. And now we're going to go ahead and open this in Audacity. So I do still use Audacity in my workflow, but I don't actually save anything that I do in Audacity. I use Audacity for these numbers down here. So, you know, let's say this is what I'm going to use for my loop. You know, I figure that out. I'm able to, you know, zoom in and find, oh, wait, go here. Or no, I zoom in even further and that's not a zero crossing. So no, let's do here, you know. So I use Audacity for that kind of stuff. And then once I'm satisfied that I found the right loops, I take these numbers down here for the selection start and end, and I just go ahead and put them in here. And that's where these numbers come from, the trim end, the loop. Crossfade, that's just a length of how long do you want the crossfade, and so that I don't actually use Audacity for. I just kind of like pick a number and test it out until I find something that sounds good. So anyway, real quick, let's oh, wait a minute. Real quick, I'm gonna pull up the numbers for this because I remember this one was kind of tricky to find. LTTOT. So again, here's these numbers. So if I pull this down here, I'm going to type these. So my loop is at 1 B 7, and the trim end is at 12 17 84.91. So normally I would find these by trial and error, you know, but I'm just going to use these because I've already done this. It does kind of annoy me that 12 17 84 17. Okay, so this is how that process would normally work. And then I'm going to go ahead and, you know, say, okay, this loops back to there. Again, I said I'm not going to really show how to do the looping process in this video. If you want to know how to do that, go back and watch my first video. I went into that a whole lot. So if we listen to this, and there's our loop. I can listen to that again. Okay, so we've established that yes, these numbers do work, because I, already did this track in the past. So let's close that, and I will just show you how this would work entering things manually rather than copy and pasting. So we go in here. So we know we want to trim the end of the file here. We go here and, oh, look at that, trim end. 12178.491. Now we want to loop here. You also get these hints, you know, all of this, the auto completion, the hints, all of that comes from this schema line right here. And that's the feature that I have not found anywhere else in any other editor where it does. I've found editors that do schema validation, but most of them, it would be like you wrote all your stuff out and then you'd go up here to like tools and say schema validate, and it would just say yes or no, or it would say error at line 15 or whatever. But Visual Studio Code actually gives you this really fully featured editing experience from this schema. So our loop is at 132.617. Now, something else we could do, if we wanted to, we could come in here and maybe, you know, sometimes they have really long silences at the beginning. Maybe we want to get rid of that, right? So we can just come in here and say, okay, here's where the music actually starts. I like to use really round numbers, so this, we'll just call it 15,000, right? Because it's 15,008. So we come back, you know, there. So we can put a trim start here. The order of where these things go actually does not matter. The order of when these things are actually applied is something that I have hard coded into the application because I have to do some of these things in particular orders in order for things to work out properly. There are more complex ways of, if you need things to happen in a particular order, you can do that with subtracks and subchannels. It will process the deepest subtrack first, and then it works its way up the tree. But we don't need that right now. 15,000. So just know that, yeah, the order of this stuff doesn't matter. You put it in any order. I just like to put it in a particular order because it's easier to keep track of, and it looks better. And then, yeah, basically that should be enough to run it. And then you see here, it's working on track number 1, and it's done. And if we go here, oops, back to here, here's our track1.pcm. And we can go ahead and listen to it in foobar. And we can go to the end. And we'll hear that loop. And you'll notice the cursor just stays here at the end, and it doesn't like jump back to the loop point. That's just how it works. But it'll keep playing infinitely. One caveat here is if you're having it loop back to the very beginning of the song, which means that either your loop point is at 0 or your loop point and your trim start point are the same, it will not loop. And that was intentional because that, to this program, it looks like a song that shouldn't loop, and like short little jingles and stuff like that. And I did not want to have it looping really, really short songs really, really fast. But you can still do that by going to playback, order, say repeat track. If you repeat the track, then it will go ahead and loop that song if that's the case. So that right there is basically all there is to it. You just get the numbers for where your loops are, you put them in, you run the tool. You want another track, put it in another track, track number 2, and you go from there. Then, your final thing is going to look something like this. It's just a big list of stuff like that. So that's all you really need to know to get started. I'm going to really quick go over a couple of the more advanced things just so that you're aware that they exist and kind of keep that in mind. For one thing, it does automatic sample conversion or sample rate conversion. So in the past, sometimes I've downloaded files that happen to be, 48,000 kilohertz sample rate. 48,000 kilohertz, 48 kilohertz sample rate. And then you would go and you'd be doing all of this stuff and you get all your numbers and they wouldn't work properly. You need to wonder why. And then you'd realize that it was because it was the wrong sample rate. So you were picking the wrong sample numbers. msupcm++ does all of that conversion for you. So if this was a 48K song, and you said, okay, let's use, 16,333 for our trim start, it would trim the start right here. So you don't want to touch this value. You don't want to change this value because remember, msupcm++ is using the original file. So if the original file is 48K, keep it in 48K for your numbers. And the same goes for all of the numbers in it. Your fade lengths, your loop points, your trim points, your pad lengths, all of them. That's all going to be based on the input. So let's see here. Okay, fade calculations. So let's say we did trim it here. And then we wanted to do a fade in, right? You want to do a fade in like that long, right? This is the one time you actually want to use this length here. Otherwise, you want to make sure you're always in end. I can't tell you how many times I've left it in length and then you get all the wrong numbers, and it's not fun. But so for this though, you want your fade to be like that. Cool. 24,450. That's the number that you put in for fade in. Fade in starts at the beginning of the track, and it lasts for whatever length you put in. Same for fade out. Fade out starts, if you want to think of it that way, the fade in starts at the end of the file and counts backwards for whatever length you put. Crossfades only apply to loops. There are ways, if you want to mix multiple files and you want to crossfade them together, those you still have to kind of do a little bit manually. The crossfade parameter is for loops. And what it does is it goes from the end of the file and it jumps back to wherever the loop point is, and it crossfades the section before the loop. That makes sense. So if I'm just going to pick random spots. So let's say your loop was here to here, right? And then you wanted a 10,000 sample crossfade. What it would do is it would take the 10,000 samples before the loop. Well, okay, so what it would do, let's see here. It would take the 10,000 samples at the end here and start to fade them out. And it would take this 10,000 samples before here, and it would copy them up here and start fading them in. And that's where you get your crossfades. And again, it's just the length of the crossfade that you put into the JSON file. You can do a couple of other things really quick. Let me see if I can find an example. Okay, so subtracks and subchannels. This is something you probably should go watch my second tutorial for, but to give a very short overview of what they are, a subtrack, or a list of subtracks, I should say, everything inside one of these subtracks, you can do everything that you can do inside of a normal track. You wouldn't have a track number or a separate title, but you can have a separate file, or if you don't specify a file, it will just use the file that you specified here for all of your subtracks. But you can have separate files for each of them. The main thing to know is that subtracks are concatenated one after another, and subchannels they start at the same time and they're mixed together. You can combine subtracks and subchannels almost infinitely. There's no hard limit. I haven't really tested how far you can recurse, but you can have a subtrack inside of a subchannel, inside of a subtrack, inside of a subchannel. You can't have subtracks inside of subtracks. That wouldn't make sense, because then you could have just flattened it out. And you can't have subchannels inside of subchannels. That one's just a limitation. But if you want to have subchannels inside of subchannels for some reason, you can just nest it inside of a subtrack. Again, that's something you should really go check out the second video for. Something that is less complex, that is very helpful, is option. And you can do nested options like I'm doing here. But let's say you're messing around with a track and you're like, well, maybe I want this loop, or maybe I want this longer loop, or maybe I have these two completely separate tracks that I want to try, and I'm not really sure, but I don't want to have to delete the work that I did and replace it with the other option, and then like maybe save it in a separate text file or something like that. That's what options are for. So an option is just a JSON list that you give it an option number here, and then pretty much anything inside of here is anything that could have gone up here. So you can see, basically, trying to think how to explain this. Okay, so there's two parts to it. There's use option and there's options. So when I have use option 1, that's as if I took everything inside of option 1, which is the subtracks, and I copied it and I just pasted it up here. If I switch this to use option 2, then it doesn't use this stuff, it uses that instead. So again, probably I do a better job of explaining that in my second video, but this is really helpful if you're not really sure how you want to do something and you want to just be like, okay, I tried that, it sounded okay, throw it into an option, and then we'll start a second option, and then we can just switch back and forth between them real quick. Finally, the last thing I'm going to touch on for this video is that there is okay, actually two things. So first track and last track. So every time you run msupcm++, it will reconvert all of the files. And that can take a while if you have, 30 or 40 files in here. So if you're just testing one, or, you want to test out tracks 1 through 5 or whatever, you set your first track to the first track you want to include, and the last track to the last track you want to include, and it will only convert those files. So if you want to convert files 1 through 5, tracks 1 through 5, you put, first track 1, last track 5. If you want to only do one file, you just set first track and last track to the same number, and then it'll only do that one. Finally, keep temps. If you have a file that it's doing something weird and you're not sure why, this can be especially if you're starting to use subtracks and subchannels, or if you're doing crossfades, go ahead and turn keep temps to true, and it'll keep some of the temporary audio files that are usually just deleted by default. And so that can be helpful for debugging and stuff. You open those up in Audacity and you can see what's going wrong. So hopefully this is a little bit more of a condensed tutorial on how to go ahead and use this. That I hope it was helpful. And if there are any questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments, or I will post a link to my Discord server that you can come and ask questions there. So yeah, I think that is everything that I wanted to cover today. So hopefully that was helpful.